The horse was dying under him. Silas Holt could feel it in the way the animal's stride had shortened over the last 2 miles. The rhythm gone ragged, the breathing coming in wet pulls that sounded like cloth tearing. The horse was a roan gelding he had borrowed from the livery in Fort Sumner 3 days ago, a good animal with deep lungs and a steady temper, and Silas had ridden it across 70 miles of New Mexico desert in July heat that turned the air into something you could taste, dust and sage and the dry mineral smell of a land that had not seen rain in 6 weeks. He had stopped twice to rest the horse, and once to sleep for 2 hours under a mesquite tree while the stars turned overhead and the coyotes talked to each other across the flats. And then he had mounted again and ridden on because the letter in his coat pocket said, children were dying, and the letter was 3 days old by the time it reached him, and every hour on the trail was an hour someone might not have. He could see Corinth now, a cluster of adobe buildings on the far side of the river, the church bell tower rising above the low rooftops, the wall around the town catching the late afternoon sun and turning it the color of old bone. A small town, 200 people, maybe less. The kind of place that doesn't appear on most maps and doesn't need to because the people who live there know where it is, and the people who don't live there have no reason to come. Except today, there was a reason. The fever had come to Corinth 3 weeks ago, and it had not left. He crossed the shallow river and rode up the slope to the main gate, and that is where the road ended. The gate was closed, not just closed, barred. Heavy timber beams across the inside, the kind of barricade you build against a war party, not against a man on a tired horse with a medical bag. 2 men stood on the wall above the gate, with the look of sentries who had been given a job they didn't understand by a man they didn't question. They looked down at Silas the way you look at something you've been told to be afraid of. "The town is closed," one of them called down. "Alderman's orders. No one in or out until the fever passes." Silas steadied the roan and looked up at them. He had not shaved in 3 days. His coat was white with dust. His eyes were the particular kind of red that comes from riding into wind and sun for 70 miles without proper rest. He did not look like a doctor. He looked like a man the desert had been working on and hadn't finished with. "My name is Silas Holt. I'm a physician. I was sent for. A woman named Ruth Adler wrote to Fort Sumner asking for a doctor, and I am the doctor who came." The sentries looked at each other. One of them disappeared behind the wall, and Silas could hear voices, the muffled argument of men who know they are making a decision above their station, and then a different voice came from behind the gate, a voice that carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Doctor, my name is Fletcher Bain. I'm the alderman of this town. I appreciate the ride, but I cannot open this gate. We have fever inside these walls, and the only thing keeping it from spreading further is keeping these walls sealed. Every person who comes through this gate is a risk. Every person who leaves is a risk. I will not open it." Silas dismounted. His legs nearly buckled. 3 days in the saddle will do that to a man. The muscles forget how to do anything but grip. And he held the pommel until the ground felt solid, and then he walked to the gate and put his hand on the timber and spoke through the gap between the planks. "Mr. Bain, I have treated fever in 6 territories. I carry quinine and I carry willow bark extract, and I carry 20 years of knowing what this sickness does and how to slow it down. Every hour I stand outside this gate is an hour someone inside it gets worse. You sent for a doctor. I am standing at your door. I didn't send for anyone." Bain's voice was hard, the voice of a man who has confused caution with control. "A woman sent that letter without the council's approval. The council's position is clear. No one enters, no one leaves. We wait and we pray, and the fever takes who it takes, and the rest of us survive by staying sealed. The fever doesn't care about your walls, Mr. Bain. It's already inside. And letting more people in won't make it better. Silas pressed his forehead against the gate. The wood was warm from the sun. He could smell the town on the other side. Cook smoke and dust and the faint sour smell that fever towns always carry. The smell of sweat and fear and sickness hanging in air that doesn't move enough. He had smelled it in Dodge City in '78 and in Tombstone in '81 and in a dozen small towns that didn't have names big enough to remember. He knew what was happening on the other side of this wall. People lying in dark rooms, wet cloths on foreheads, children too weak to cry, and a man with a barred gate telling himself that the wall was medicine enough. He tried for an hour. He stood at the gate and spoke through the timber and explained the quinine, what it was, where it came from, how the bark of the cinchona tree had been saving lives from fever since the Jesuits brought it out of Peru 2 centuries ago. He described the treatment in detail, the way a man describes something he has done 100 times and believes in the way a preacher believes in Scripture. He offered to submit to any precaution Bain wanted. He would wash. He would change clothes. He would enter through a separate door and see no one except the sick. He would sleep in the stable if that's what it took. He would let Bain lock him in a room between visits. Anything. Bain refused everything. Every offer met the same wall of know that the timber gate was built from. The alderman's fear was older than the fever. It went back 24 years to a cholera outbreak in Missouri that had taken his first wife in 3 days, and that fear had calcified into a principle the way calcium builds on a bone that is healed wrong. Keep everything out. Seal the walls. Trust nothing that comes from beyond the gate. The principle had no room in it for quinine or doctors or the fact that the thing he was trying to keep out was already inside. The sun went down, and Silas sat with his back against the wall on the outside and the town on the other side and the darkening desert stretching east behind him. The roan stood with its head down, too tired to graze, breathing in shallow pulls that worried him. He had water in his canteen and jerky in his saddlebag and a medical bag full of medicine that was doing no one any good, sitting in the dirt outside a locked gate. A voice came from the darkness to his left, low and careful, the voice of a man who has learned to move quietly in country where noise attracts attention. "Doctor." Silas turned. A man was standing at the corner of the wall, barely visible in the last light. He was older, 60 or so, in with a dark weathered face and silver-streaked hair, and the bearing of someone who has spent his whole life in this landscape and considers it home rather than hardship. "My name is Esteban Morales. I have a ranch south of the river. I heard you at the gate." He paused. "Ruth Adler's children are sick. So are 6 others. Bain has had the gate sealed for 5 days, and in those 5 days, 2 people have died, and 3 more have gotten worse. There is no doctor inside. There is no medicine. There is a man with a locked gate and a prayer and nothing else. He won't let me in." Esteban looked at the wall. It was 8 feet of adobe, solid but not high, built in the years when the Comanche raided this far south and the town needed something between itself and the open desert. The wall runs all the way around the town. But there is a place on the south side, near the acequia, where the adobe has crumbled and the gap is wide enough for a man to pass through. I use it to bring water to Ruth's house when the well line is too long. Bain doesn't know about it. If I go through that gap and Bain finds out, he'll consider it a violation of his quarantine. Esteban looked at him with the steady expression of a man who has weighed that consideration and set it aside. "If you don't go through that gap, Ruth's children will die. The alderman's authority ends where a child's breathing begins. I will show you the way." They went on foot. Silas carried his medical bag and left the roan with Esteban's son, a quiet young man who appeared out of the dark with a horse blanket and a bucket of water, and the efficiency of someone who has been expecting this. They followed the wall south along the dry edge of the river, the stars overhead so thick and close they seemed to have weight, and the town on the other side of the wall silent except for the occasional sound of coughing that carried through the adobe like something trying to escape. The gap was where Esteban said it would be, a section of wall near the irrigation ditch where rain and time had eaten the adobe down to rubble, a passage wide enough for a man to step through sideways if he held his bag above his head. Silas went through and came out on the other side, into a narrow alley between two adobe houses, and stood in the town of Corinth for the first time, 3 days and 70 miles after he had set out to reach it. Esteban led him to Ruth Adler's house. It was a small adobe at the edge of town, in 2 rooms with a packed earth floor, and a stove and a wooden bed where 2 children lay under a thin blanket, their faces flushed and their breathing shallow and fast. Ruth was sitting between them on a stool with a basin of water and a cloth, and when Silas came through the door, she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been holding the world together with her hands and has just been told that someone else has hands too. "You came," she said. "I came." He worked through the night. He had not slept in 3 days, and the tiredness was in him like sand in a machine, slowing everything, making his thoughts heavy. But his hands knew what to do, because his hands had done it 1,000 times, and the body remembers what the mind is too tired to think about. The children first, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5. Ze both deep in the fever, both dehydrated, the boy's lips dry and the girl's skin hot to the touch, both with the rapid pulse and the shallow breathing that told him the sickness had been burning through them for days without proper treatment. He mixed quinine in water and fed it to them in small sips, holding their heads up, talking to them the way he talked to all his patients, steady and quiet and matter of fact, as if getting well were simply a task that needed doing, and he was there to help them do it. He bathed their foreheads and their wrists with cool water. He brewed willow bark tea and made Ruth drink some too, because she was halfway to collapse herself, and a sick mother is no help to sick children. Word traveled the way it always does in small towns, through walls and under doors and across the gaps between houses where women lean out windows and whisper to each other in the dark. By midnight, Silas had 4 more patients. By 2 in the morning, 6. He went house to house with his bag and his quinine and his steady voice, moving through the back alleys of Corinth like a man who understood that healing sometimes requires the same skills as smuggling: quiet feet, dark paths, and the willingness to go where you've been told not to go. Bain found out at dawn. A sentry saw lamplight moving between houses in the pattern that meant someone was making rounds, and the sentry told the alderman, and the alderman came out of his house on the plaza and walked through the town until he found Silas Holt sitting on the floor of the Garza house, mixing a dose of quinine for an old woman whose fever had broken an hour ago, and who was drinking water for the first time in 2 days. "You broke my quarantine," Bain said from the doorway. His voice shook, but not with anger, with something worse, with fear, the deep abiding fear of a man who has built a wall against the thing that took his wife, and now someone has put a hole in it. Silas looked up at him. He had not slept in 4 days. His hands were steady because a doctor's hands are always steady, even when the rest of him is falling apart. Your quarantine was killing the people it was meant to protect, Mr. Bain. You locked the sickness in and the medicine out. That is not quarantine. That is a coffin with a gate. You had no right. I had every right. I'm a doctor. These are my patients. I was asked to come, and I came, and I will not apologize for climbing through a hole in a wall to reach people who needed me. Bain stood in the doorway, and the morning light came through behind him, and Silas could see his face clearly for the first time. The rigid jaw, the white sideburns, the eyes that were not cruel but were terrified. The face of a man who had watched cholera take his wife in 3 days in a Missouri farmhouse, and had spent 24 years building walls against that memory. He was not a villain. He was a man whose grief had become a strategy, and the strategy had failed, and he was standing in the doorway of a house where a doctor he had refused was saving the people he had tried to protect. My wife died of cholera," Bain said quietly, "in '62. In Missouri, there was no doctor, there was no medicine, there was nothing I could do. I held her hand and she died, and I told myself I would never be that helpless again. The wall was the only thing I knew how to build." "I know," Silas said. "I've met the wall before. Every town I've ever ridden into has one version of it or another. The wall isn't the problem, Mr. Bain. The problem is believing the wall is enough." Bain looked at the old woman on the bed, drinking water, alive. He looked at Silas on the floor, with his medical bag open and his sleeves rolled up, and his eyes red from 4 days without rest. And something in the alderman's face shifted, the way a locked door shifts when the bolt finally slides. Not all at once, but with the slow, grinding recognition that the thing you've been holding shut needs to be opened. "What do you need?" Bain asked. "Clean water, clean cloth, someone to boil both, and I need you to open the gate so I can get my horse and the rest of my supplies." Bain nodded. He turned and walked to the plaza, and the people of Corinth watched their alderman walk to the main gate and lift the timber bars himself, one by one, and swing the gate open for the first time in 5 days. The morning light came through the opening and fell across the packed dirt of the main street and the plaza and the church steps, and the town breathed in a way it had not breathed since the gate closed. Silas stayed in Corinth for 11 days. He slept in 2-hour stretches on the floor of whichever house he happened to be in when his body finally refused to take another step. And he woke each time to the sound of someone coughing or calling or the quiet knock of a neighbor who had come to say that another house needed him. He treated 23 patients in those 11 days. He mixed quinine until his supply ran low, and then he brewed willow bark tea and cool compresses, and the steady reassurance of a man who has seen fever break 100 times and knows that the breaking always comes if you give the body enough time and enough water and enough reason to keep fighting. He lost 2, an old man whose heart gave out before the fever did, and an infant who had been sick before the fever arrived and who didn't have the strength to fight both battles. He sat with both of them as they went, and he marked their names in the small notebook he carried in his coat pocket, where he kept a record of everyone he had treated and everyone he had lost, because a doctor who forgets his losses is a doctor who stops trying to prevent them. The rest lived. Ruth Adler's children were sitting up and eating corn mush by the 4th day, and by the 7th day, the boy was out of bed and walking to the well with a bucket and the particular determination of a child who has decided that being sick is finished and being alive is the only job that matters. On the 11th day, Silas packed his medical bag and saddled the roan, who had been resting at Esteban's ranch and had recovered better than Silas had. He rode to the main gate, which stood open now, propped with a stone. And Fletcher Bain was standing beside it, in his dark wool suit and his wide-brimmed hat, and the posture of a man who has not quite forgiven himself for the days the gate was closed. "Doctor," Bain said. He held out his hand. "I owe you more than I can say." Silas shook his hand. "You owe me nothing. But if another fever comes, and it will, don't build a wall against it. Build a road. Make it easy for help to arrive. That's the only medicine that works at a distance." He rode out through the open gate and down the slope to the river and across it, the roan stepping carefully through the shallow water and climbing the far bank with the strength of an animal that had rested well and eaten well and was ready for the long road home. The town of Corinth watched him go from the wall that had been built to keep danger out and had almost kept salvation out instead. Fletcher Bain stood at the gate with his hands at his sides and watched until the rider was small against the desert, and then smaller still, and he did not close the gate behind him. He would not close it again for a long time. The timber bars that had sealed the town stayed propped against the inside of the wall where he had left them, and the weeds grew around them. And eventually someone used the wood for fence posts, which was a better use for timber than barring a door against the people trying to help. Ruth Adler was standing at the gate with her 2 children beside her, the boy holding her left hand and the girl holding her right. And the 3 of them watched the doctor ride east until the desert swallowed him, and there was nothing left but the dust and the heat and the long road back to Fort Sumner. Esteban Morales repaired the gap in the south wall the following week. He filled it with new adobe and let it dry in the sun, and when it was solid, he stood back and looked at it and decided it was good work. But he left a small gap at the bottom, about 6 inches, just enough to let the water from the acequia pass through when the ditch ran high in spring. And just enough, he told Ruth, with the particular smile of a man who plans for every possibility, to let a man slide a medical bag through if the gate was ever locked again.